Hi, my name's Vince Holton, and for some time I've been running a YouTube channel called Classic Car TV. This has been good fun and we've created quite a few videos, but it's been a hobby more than anything. My day job is making corporate video for the technology industry. My most successful video on the channel so far has been one which I called "Is the MGB the perfect entry-level classic?" Now it seems like a lot of the viewers like that one. It's had about 125,000 views so far, and I guess it must have made some money for YouTube, but it hasn't made a penny for me. So now I've decided to focus a little bit more on the Classic Car TV channel. Well, let's make this clear from the start. It's not going to be about car reviews. If you want car reviews, there's Harry Metcalf, Chris Harris, Henry Catchpole, and I certainly won't be giving cars Doug scores. So I'm interested in design and, critically, what defines a classic car. At what point in time does a modern car become a classic car, and can any modern car become a classic? So I'm going to make what I'm calling my Modern Classics series. But I'm also going to look at values too. In recent times, owning a classic car has not just been about having a bit of fun. If you pick carefully, your car might also have appreciated in value too. Now, I have read just this week that the average classic car may actually be going down in value at the moment. But this isn't true for more special cars, high-end cars, rare cars, race cars with special history. For a number of years now, cars in this category have had the potential to make serious amounts of money, and far better than leaving your money in the bank. So I'm going to make this Modern Cars series, but it's not just my thoughts you'll have to listen to. Along the way, I'm going to gather together some people who've had special involvement with the various cars that we're going to be looking at, and we'll be looking to hear their thoughts too. We've got a great lineup for this film, for example. So good, in fact, that I'm a bit worried I may not be able to keep up the standard for future films. But we had to start somewhere. We had to choose our first car. Well, you've seen the opening to this film, so you'll know I chose the McLaren MP4-12C, a car that, to me, has modern classic written all over it. Unveiled in 2009 and launched in 2011, the MP4-12C was McLaren's first series production road car. Yes, there'd been the F1, of which 106 cars, including road versions, prototypes and race cars, were built between 1992 and 1998, and the Mercedes-Benz SLR McLaren, the joint venture with Mercedes-Benz, and of which just over 2,000 were built between 2003 and 2007. But these weren't McLaren production series cars. The MP4-12C was McLaren's first. The MP4-12C is a light car, just 1,301 kilograms. It's powerful too. The engine, which was developed by McLaren, Ilmor and Ricardo, was originally rated at 592 brake horsepower and 443 pounds-foot of torque. But a short while after the car's launch, this was uprated to 616 bhp, and this upgrade was offered free of charge to owners of early cars, and it was made standard from 2013. But enough of my waffling. I told you I was going to bring in some experts to help me work out what a classic is, whether the MP4-12C is a classic or has the potential to become a classic. I've gathered together three really good guys. There's Frank Stephenson, the automotive design superstar. Frank joined McLaren in the middle of 2008 to design the MP4-12C and stayed with the company until 2017. During that time, he designed all of the McLaren cars that you see listed here. Frank's also responsible for many other classic designs, including the BMW X5, the BMW Mini, Ferrari F430, the Fiat 500 and many, many more. The man's a legend. Then we have Dean Lanzante. His company, also called Lanzante, is probably best known for running the Ueno Clinic F1 GTR at Le Mans in 1995 and winning it at the F1's first attempt. Since that time, Lanzante has made a name for itself through projects such as road conversions of the McLaren P1 GTR, which was previously a track-only car. The company is now an officially approved McLaren service centre for road and race cars. But someone that a lot of McLaren owners will have actually had personal contact with is Alastair Bols. Alastair was employed to set up McLaren's first showroom in Park Lane in London in 2010, and to launch the MP4-12C itself. Alastair stayed with McLaren for a while and sold hundreds of cars, but then chose to set out on his own and become an independent. since which time he's sold somewhere in the region of 500 McLarens. Crikey. Sales numbers like these do lead us to have to think about values, of course. Today, with PCP and leasing, people think less about actual list prices and more about what the monthly payment will be. But there's no doubting the fact that the MP4-12C has depreciated. This particular car that we're featuring in the movie that we're looking at now had a list price when it was new in 2011 of £202,000. This is a really nice, early, low mileage, swipe door car and must be one of the more valuable examples. But it's true to say that today, and for quite a few years now, virtually all MP4-12Cs have lingered in the £70,000 to £90,000 price bracket. Sadly, McLarens do have a reputation for depreciating harder than some of the more competing brands. So we'll be asking our experts to give us their opinions on that too. Getting these guys all together in one place to film them was going to be impossible, so I filmed them individually, and in Frank's case we did the norm today, which is an online video call interview. I then put them all together, and I hope you're okay with the format. I devised a pretty simple set of questions as the basis for the interviews and to keep us all on the same track. The one I kicked off with was the one that got everybody really scratching their heads, and it's the most basic question of all. What does define a classic car, and what is it that makes a modern a potential classic? Here's how they reacted.
Oh, that's a good question. That's probably the hardest question of all the ones I saw you write down there.
I know, everybody's struggling with it.
Well, because there is, you can't, the reason is because there's no set answer. You can't be wrong, you can't be right. The only obvious thing is that it doesn't become an instant classic. People often refer to cars as being instant classics. That's impossible, simply because it takes time to grow into the mindset or into the feeling. You can fall instantly in love, of course, that happens a lot, love at first sight kind of thing like that. Indeed. But a classic is much more than just falling in love.
That's a tough one. I mean, obviously older cars have become a classic through nature almost, rather than being engineered as a classic. And this can be even basic cars, not necessarily they become collectors' cars, even though they may be mainstream cars, such things as a Fiat 500 or 2CV, where there were many hundreds of thousands made, or in the Beatles' case, millions. And then because they're so commonplace, they end up becoming disposable and then consequently become a classic.
Personal taste is a huge thing. I think the other thing that you have to look at is the generation that had a car on the wall as a poster. When they grow older, I think they want to have a taste of that youth, if you will, again. So for my generation, there's a big modern classic sway towards the Renault Clio V6, or even the Cup cars that Renault make, because they're fun to drive, and who knew Renault slapping an engine behind you would be an investment. But the Peugeot 205 GTI, in a very different model segment, but those were cars that we, at my age, we couldn't drive because we hadn't learned to drive, or they were out of our insurance range, but we hankered after them a lot from our peers. So we're now buying into them, and they've grown tremendously in value. The Ford range of RS and Cosworth range, again, same sort of thing.
Classic has a few things going for it that make it a classic. It has to be unique. It has to have a distinct character. It has to have positive appeal in spite of the fact that it perhaps even has quite a few defects. There are a lot of cars that are classics that, if you actually nailed them or looked at them, dissect, you'd find that the feet aren't in the right position when you're driving. You can't reach this easily. Your head gets banged on, the cant rail, or vision is horrible. there's so many things wrong with a lot of classic cars. So you have to eliminate the factor that people say it's a fantastic design, because a lot of classics aren't fantastic designs. But what it does is grow in appeal to those who are interested in that car, not obviously to non-petrol heads, but to petrol heads who know about the business or about history. There's a magical, I don't know, it's fairy dust sprinkled over a car that makes you start to want it. That's what adjusts prices in the market many times of classic cars. You know, they'll stagnate, and then suddenly you whiff, you smell them. It's like walking into a bakery shop, not knowing that you wanted to buy something. Suddenly you want to buy the whole shop, or especially the almond croissants or something.
Build numbers obviously makes a difference. Yeah, that will always, you know, if we're in the hundreds, then it's most likely it's going to be pretty scarce. In the 12C's case, obviously there's, I mean, just over 2,000 of the coupe and just over 1,000 of the Spider, so it's relatively low numbers.
Again, a lot of times what will create a classic is the fact that the new one has come out, and it's probably, or it should be, new and improved and faster and better and more reliable, all that, but they become too perfect. And when a car becomes almost too perfect, it's almost losing out on those personal traits that made it so unique to begin with.
In the more modern times, we've had manufacturers, particularly with the more luxury brands, almost engineer classics by doing limited numbers, limited availability, and so maybe we're going into a little different in more recent times than we have in the past.
We always ask why women love the bad guys, the bad boys. It's because they have a lot more character than the boring, you know, predictable good guys. They have a wild streak.
You know, if we're in the hundreds and it's a loved car, because that's the other thing, there are cars that are in low numbers but not as loved. It's interesting, I sit here with a long-tail McLaren F1 GTR, and there's less of these than the short-tail F1 GTR, but the value of a short-tail GTR is more. So the numbers thing can be relevant, but not always.
Then I asked the guys whether the MP4-12C is a guaranteed future classic, as it was McLaren's first relatively large-scale production road car. I also asked Frank if the F1 influenced the MP4-12C, as I don't know what you think, but I think there are some hints there in the design.
When you're trying to create an honest design language, you should reflect and respect the past. If it's a good past, obviously, yes, of which the F1 doesn't get any better for that type of car. Yet it was so far back in McLaren's history, well, not so far back, but far enough back, you know, a few generations, or quite a few generations in car design terms, that if we'd have kept the whole philosophy of the F1, we would have ended up with a car probably that wouldn't sell very many of them, simply because the F1 was so purposely designed. With the 12C, the car had to be, I wouldn't call it a volume product, but basically put McLaren back on the map as a competitor to the other segment, to the other car manufacturers. Yeah. So in that respect, you had to, I wouldn't say compromise on the design in respect to the F1, but you would have to do it in such a way that it became, you know, almost an everyday car. That was one of the big driving factors of the 12C, was that it suddenly, even though it's, you know, in that segment there, the 12C was meant to be a car that you could drive every day.
I think the first car from any manufacturer coming out, going back to Ferraris, Porsches, Lamborghinis, there'll always be something in it, and it's the same with any brand, I suppose. The first of are always, someone wants one of those within the collection because it's the very first of its kind. And with McLaren, it was McLaren cars that produced the McLaren F1, and it was McLaren as a group that produced the SLR for Mercedes. So McLaren Automotive's first car, being by the book, was the MP4-12C. So those cars will be classed as the first, and I think if you have precedent, as I said, from any other product, the first is always something someone wants within a collection.
I mean, nothing's guaranteed, but again, I think it's an interesting phase because it's just over a decade old, and it'd be interesting to see how we look upon it maybe in another 5 years. And I suppose also where the company stands in that period of time. Obviously, when the 12C came out, it was at a time with Lewis Hamilton and Jenson Button driving at McLaren. It was a time when they were hugely competitive, and there was a lot of interest, obviously, in McLaren then. Obviously, when the F1 came out, it was on the back of winning multiple world championships with Senna and Prost. So I suppose a lot of it will also depend on where McLaren stands as a brand in the future too.
With the next future sway of the market, I think this 12C has every part of ingredient that you would want, and those ingredients come from the first of a make, the rarity, picking those sub 190 chassis if you're being very picky. Some people say they're the worst built, but now after years of being tinkered with and fettled, I think they're as good as all of them. I think there's no difference.
A lot of things that would have been that were firsts, I think, in the segment, which mainly, of course, was the stiffness of the platform, the carbon tub, allowing in that segment never seen before a carbon tub, which is usually reserved for hypercar segments or very expensive cars.
But in history, it's always been ultimately a very successful brand in motorsport, and obviously when they came out with the 12C, it wasn't a common known brand across the world. It was in the UK and it was in Europe, but certainly in America there was a little bit more education to do for people on where McLaren have come from and what they stand for.
And then if we're looking at the F1 for what influenced it, well, ergonomically you can't really beat what we call a dihedral door system. So that was laid out very early in the brief. We wanted the car to be more English than Italian in that segment. In other words, more restrained, more British Savile Row type look than Versace out of Milan. That was the aim, to go about it in such a way that we didn't make it outlandish, and there was a restrained look to it, which is what it got criticized for at the beginning. A lot of the press and journalists were saying that the car was perhaps too restrained, although now, in hindsight, they're all saying, well, good shot, because that car has stood the test of time in looks. It could have been better. I know that one of your questions was, would you have changed anything? I would have changed all of it if I could. You ask a designer that kind of that's a loaded question for a designer, because if he ever says, no, I'm happy with it, he might as well hang up his tools and go home. He's run out of ideas.
And it's been a conversation I've been having for 5 or 6 years now, that the 12C, for its classic styling and everything else that it's got, will have in a McLaren badge car, other than an F1, the greatest potential.
Then I asked the guys what characteristics of the MP4-12C might define it as a future classic. Is it the design itself? Is it the powertrain? Is it perhaps the driving experience?
It's not one thing. That's not what makes a car classic. One thing cannot a classic car make. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
Not a classic car make. That sounds like Shakespeare. But I think it's the combination. You're getting a great ride. You're getting incredible performance, and that feeling the road through the seat of your pants.
Obviously, the big key feature of it, we've seen carbon fibre chassis in road cars before, but not to this scale, and certainly not to this cost of vehicle. Relative to its retail cost, to have a carbon fibre chassis was a pretty new thing at the time. I know it has been done with other cars now, things like the Alphas, but at the time it was a pretty groundbreaking thing.
The 12C Coupe, there must really only be a few thousand worldwide. And in the UK, my guess is now there's perhaps 250 coupes. So that number, certainly against other competitive marques, is very, very low. So that has to, with all the other factors about specification, mileage, and the usual product search criteria, that has to aid its future potential.
And it could certainly be improved to make it more characterful was absolutely the sound of the car, the engine noise. And we did a lot of things. I mean, the NVH department, noise, vibration, harshness department have people that are solely only dedicated to the sound of the car. And what they did was they took a lot of the development into taking the bass waves of the engine into the cabin, into behind the seats. And that did one thing, but what I mean is that drive-by noise or that drive-by sound appeal. They're restricted in decibels, of course, but if Ferrari can do it and other companies can do it, I think McLaren downplayed that advantage there too much. I think it should have been a bit, not raucous, not like that, but definitely not as muted as it always sounded to me. If you were standing on the side of the street and you heard a Ferrari drive past and then you heard a McLaren, you'd look at the McLaren thing.
And also the suspension system, the dynamic suspension system that's in the 12C and continues through McLaren models has made the car have so much usability in various driving modes, from comfort mode to sports mode. So you can literally take this car from using it comfortably on the road and very sociably to performing with incredible track performance. So the suspension system was really quite groundbreaking for its time.
I finished off by asking the guys whether McLaren's history and track record mean that all of its cars have future classic status, and of those, which are most likely to stand out as the most revered classics.
It's difficult because it's now become a mainstream manufacturer, and I think even when you look at brands such as Porsche and Ferrari, both over 70 years old, both with far more heritage than McLaren, even all of their cars are certainly not guaranteed that sort of status. So it would depend on where McLaren move forward in the future. If the brand builds an SUV or something like that, clearly not every model is going to be a classic moving forward.
Taking our revered Italian counterparts as a point to help that, there are those cars from Ferrari that won't be as revered as others, and that may be because they just weren't as successful in their day, or the aesthetical pleasing whole mix of criteria that people will look for. So I can't say that every McLaren is going to be an investment. I think you have to look at, within any product range, the more the potential of investment, the lower the number.
Who's to say McLaren next year might not be around? People are canceling left and right some of their orders. Cars aren't getting delivered. The Artura should have been on the road long ago. McLaren Artura.
But if it stays on low volume sports cars with performance, being the focal point, there's every chance it could be. And then people may even reflect back and look back at the 12C as the starting point for where McLaren are at that current time.
A classic car comes around by age and time, but classic and collectible, I think you have to have ingredients that no one could put their exact finger on, but it has to be around numbers, it has to be around the first, it has to be around collectability in limited edition. You know, if you have a limited edition, you can surely put your hand on your heart and say that's more collectible than others.
They had a long-term strategy where they were going to be developing many different models and splaying off from their 3-model range, the sports car, supercar, and the hypercar. But all that got sort of rethought after COVID, or during COVID probably, and they've just gone very wide and a lot of different cars. And almost it's hard to say right now. Do they have a clear, concise plan for the future? Kind of worries me, because it's almost like they're trying to sell by offering varieties instead of one solid car, like they had at the beginning, which was a sports series, super series, and what was the other one? Ultimate series.
I think obviously everyone always looks at the F1 being the first road car that McLaren, well, the M6 GT, but that was a very low volume. But the F1 is certainly what everyone looks at as the first road car. But the 12C's certainly been the start of McLaren being a mainstream car manufacturer. I think a lot of classics are born from a story or circumstance. Obviously the F1 was because of it being a central seater, because of it ultimately going on to win Le Mans as well, and its scarce numbers. But if we look forward on where we're at with current McLarens, the P1 came out in a period, not just in itself, but obviously it was part of a trilogy of cars with the 918 and the LaFerrari, where there was very much this sort of arms race between these huge manufacturers of who could build the ultimate hypercar at the time. And with the use of hybrid power, huge horsepower figures coming from all 3 variants. So the P1 would certainly, and does seem to be lasting the test of time quite well in that. And given its very low numbers, very low build numbers, and its quite outrageous looks. Its looks for the time, this sort of shrink-wrapped bodywork that we've only seen in really Le Mans sports cars and Formula One before. To see that in a road car was really quite groundbreaking. So P1 certainly seems to be heading in that way. And then the other models sort of after that, when we had like 720, 570, they're more mainstream models. So that is definitely going to take a longer burn to see whether they're actually going to mature into a classic at all.
I can't say that every McLaren will be collectible, but certainly there's the 12C and 1 or 2 others since that I think have the right ingredients for someone. It may be 5, it may be 10, it may be 20 years until that comes around, but a discerning collector, I think, would be right with a variety of brands within a collection. I think someone with their eyes wide open to what the automotive collection should hold if it's not just one mark. I think a 12C sits fairly well in that to be something that someone can say, oh, that was the first that they produced, and 20 years down the line, hopefully that will come to fruition.
And then, quite a controversial car in its looks is the Senna, in that it's actually got, a name that's one of the most important names in motoring history, but its looks are quite different. And now that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. It's not everybody's taste, but it's certainly been designed around performance, designed around aerodynamics and purpose. And that in the future may have an appreciation. But again, at the moment, it's sort of in a period, it's 3-4 years old, very early to sort of say with a car like that. And then we move on to the more current stuff, Speedtail, only 106, central seat, 3-seater. So there's obviously low numbers of that. And then also, which is quite interesting because it follows almost a similar story to F1, is the Elva, although not being the most practical vehicle, not having a windscreen, but the build numbers are so low because of it actually not being a success. They actually wanted to build far more. The build numbers became far fewer, and we may in the future look back on that and say, actually, that, you know, with such limited supply, that may be a classic too.
Within the McLaren automotive segment of product, I think there are going to be one or two cars that, other than the 12C, I can't say guaranteed because who knows what the future brings. And I even have a crystal ball on my desk there, which is used on occasion but has yet to bear fruit. But within the P11 chassis, which was 12C, 650, 675 and P1, I think the P1 being the part of the Holy Trinity has great potential. The 675 LT, again, great potential there, and we're seeing values of those low numbered cars going up. The 765, probably, again, low numbers, but it's too young to tell. And you know, one or two others within the ranges, the special editions, the 650 Le Mans or the 12C 50th anniversary, anything like that in limited numbers for an occasion, there are always ones that have the greater potential.
I mean, the F1 was supposed to have 300 built and only ended up with 64. We don't have a crystal ball to tell or a time machine, but it'd be interesting to know if there were 300 McLaren F1s, where would it stand in status at the moment? It certainly wouldn't be as rare and certainly wouldn't be as valuable either.
Apart from the P1, perhaps, one car I think anybody should really hold on for, if they have one, is the 675 LT. And then next to that, probably the very, very first edition of the MP4-12C, where it had those defects, which will make it a classic. You couldn't open the door unless you hit G-spot. But again, that, to me, is the 12C as the beginning of the McLaren range. I think it's going to, I mean, if I had one, I would not sell it, for sure.
So there you have it. Wasn't that fascinating? As you can expect, there's a lot more interesting chat in each of the individual interviews. So what I'm going to do is to edit them one by one and post them up on the Classic Car TV YouTube channel so that you can watch them all of the way through. There's some quite provocative stuff in there, including stories from Frank about his time working for McLaren. So if you would like to see the individual interviews and the rest of the films in the Modern Classics series, please give us a like and subscribe to the channel so that you can see the new films when they're published. Moving on, there's what comes next. What cars should we feature in the Modern Classics series? We've been giving it some thought. There's Ferraris, of course, cars like the 550 Maranello, 512M, 599 GTO, Porsches such as the 911R, and many, many more. We'd love to hear your thoughts, what you think we should cover in the Modern Classics series, so let us know in the comments below. But let's finish off with my thoughts on the MP4-12C. What did I think of it? Well, honestly, I love it. The car's 11 years old, and it's still a real event to drive. It turns heads wherever it goes, especially in the Volcano Orange. It's ridiculously fast, handles wonderfully, and sounds great. It's a real event to drive. True, I'm a Brit and so mildly biased, and I want the McLaren to do well. But by any reasonable standards, I think the MP4-12C definitely qualifies as a modern classic. Well, that's it. Thanks so much for watching, and here's to the next video.